I did it right. So, oops, I am going to stop sharing my screen now. Oh, Greg is back, yay. And let Marcia introduce our first presenter, Kalina Chung. Oh, actually, sorry, I should give you the format. Kalina will be presenting first about her practice, then it'll be Michelle, and then me and Marcia will go over public administrator tips for moving your practice from studio to permanent. So you can kind of tap in and tap out however you want, but remember this is recorded, so we'll be able to offer the recording later. I haven't sent out last week's recording yet, but I will. I'm going to upload them all to YouTube. So Marcia, I'm following it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Elishba. So as Elishba said, we have been working really hard at trying to pull together different opportunities for artists of any type to learn about the field of public art. So we know a lot of artists, hundreds of artists, literally, and we wanted to select artists who had different experiences in the field of public art. And our first speaker today is Kalina Chung, who is relatively new to the field. She was born and raised in Seattle and has been doing work that addresses various sculptural processes and media. She's worked with glass and wood, clay, and her work revolves around themes of the human relationships and interactions and tangible and intangible connections to the natural world. So she's going to be talking as a fairly recent artist into the field. She took our public art training a few years back and finished the University of Washington in 2016, but has a lot of excitement and energy and creativity that she will share with you, starting with how she began her work and transitioned from studio to gallery to museum to temporary works and then to permanent. So pay attention, you'll learn a lot. And not everyone's path is the same way. A lot of people jump around. So just listen to see what she has to say and see what might apply to you as well. Okay, so with that, Kalina, thank you. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Marcia. As she mentioned, my name's Kalina, and I'm just gonna go ahead and get started.
Thank you.
All right. As Marcia mentioned, I will be talking about transitioning from studio to public art. After graduating, I wasn't sure how to utilize the skills gained towards the real world, and I'm so thankful I applied and was accepted into the public art boot camp ran by Marcia and Elishba. While I had a wonderful and enriching experience at college, there isn't necessarily a class that teaches you how to specifically become a public artist. During this boot camp, I learned so much about the administrative side of public art making, as well as made connections with the presenters and fellow boot campers. I learned that a public artist role can include these listed above. While some public artists prefer to take on all these roles, it's very common for people to outsource some of these demands. One day, I shall be able to afford an assistant. Here's a sample budget sheet I received at a public art conference. Feel free to screenshot it for future reference and guidance. It's very common that you will be asked how you plan to allocate your project's funding. So talking about sustainability and studio space, I've received a lot of help from family and friends for studio spaces to execute projects. I've used empty storefronts, a gallery in between shows, and the ultimate family hookup, which was my dad's storage unit. But unfortunately, it was lit on fire a month ago, so I don't have a physical space right now to work besides my home. As you can imagine, the fire brought up a lot of challenges, and one of which was that all of my material and labor for a temporary installation is now all gone. But this is where communication is really important. And so I informed my project manager, and we were able to have an open conversation about how and where to move on from here, concept and budget wise. However, I got a printer, which is really cool and will make my business more streamlined and translating ideas much clearer. This is a slide of my past work in a studio gallery setting. You'll notice that my choice of material includes glass, wood, metal, and fibers. Transitioning into the start of my temporary public artwork, right before I was accepted into boot camp, I was granted my first commission for a series called Art in Parks. Going through the boot camp training provided me with a lot of resources, which ultimately impacted the execution of this piece titled Passing By. The painted wooden sculpture is 20 feet long, 12 feet high, and 8 feet wide. This piece was located at Delridge Playfield Park, which is in the neighborhood I grew up in and where my parents continue to reside. As a local Delridge artist, I utilized a mint color that is representative of the Cottage Grove Court, an iconic housing complex in the Delridge community. The carpenter frame on the left represents a traditional rooftop home, painted mint, transforming and escalating into the generic blue box that many architects then thought was super modern. The artwork interacts with this exponentially growing city and the effects on neighborhoods, creating a conversation on gentrified affected architecture. Challenges I faced in this piece. This was the first time I'd ever been to a ProView meeting, which is basically a meeting with many representatives from the city and parks to make sure that you are thinking through every step of the way. Their expertises include architecture, engineering, conservation, parks and rec. In the presentation, I showed every angle of wood cuts, where the screws would go in and how the anchors would work. Public safety is the #1 concern. For example, I had mentioned pre-painting all the pieces and doing touch-ups if necessary in the field. The paint fumes were brought up as a potential concern. Aesthetically, I would have preferred for the carpentry frames to be upright without any additional support. However, due to wood's nature, I needed to add cross bracing for stability. Another challenge was the climbability of this piece being seen as high. In order for the sculpture to not topple over, I needed to add footings. This was also a new learning experience, and an installation team called ArtSite, who I met through the boot camp, were able to help guide me through the process. On the park's location side, it's often you'll do a location site visit, in which we scouted out potential spots, then made sure the location was surveyed for clearance of no pipes or potential things to burst into. During install, we saved the soil and grass, which was then placed back after deinstall. Due to the overall stability concern, the artwork was taped off until it got the structural engineering stamp of approval. Next. Oh, why isn't it going next? Oh, okay. Being a participant of boot camp also had opportunities for the artists to create public art. I was selected for the Seattle Center Sculpture Walk, and my project manager was Alicia. 2017 was the year of the rooster. This piece, titled Wake Up Call, is assembled of scavenged antique roosters and weather vanes to represent the American weathercock. It was important to me that these objects had withstood a time before the current clash of disparate cultures and beliefs which continue to stir turmoil and violence throughout our nation. The rooster symbolizes civic responsibility, protection, and courage. There were 8 placed atop lampposts surrounding the key arena. Good feng shui. Dependent on how long a temporary project will be up, you can determine which materials will safely withstand that duration. This piece is titled Cusp, a collaboration with Colin Bampton. Knowing the sculpture would only be up for 3 to 6 months, we knew we could safely utilize wood for this very low budget project of $500. Summer 2017, I was also an emerging arts leader intern at the Seattle Art Museum. My focus was in education and community programs. This internship was holistic in that my intern mate and I had the ability to shadow all the departments. A few of the opportunities we had included shadowing the CEO, leading a public tour in the Sam galleries, and my favorite, a museum tour on a closed day with the exhibition designer and mount maker. At the end of that summer, the SAM was to close their original location, the Asian Arts Museum in Capitol, for renovation. Oh, I think it does that because people are trying to. As the staff knew I was an active artist, they invited me to participate in a community closing event. Each artist was given their own gallery space to do pretty much whatever they wanted. And as you can imagine, we all went nuts. I really wanted to utilize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, which led me to food. A 4,000-year-old bowl of noodles was unearthed in China, which is the earliest example of noodles found. Tummy Travels is an installation that celebrates the multitude of noodles across various countries, crops, and cultures. I used 10 different noodles, including potatoes, soba, eggs, spinach, lentil, and rice. My latest temporary installation at Judkins Park is inspired by the discovery of apple snail eggs. And on a canoe swamp ride in Cambodia a couple years ago, I We were going through the water and I found these very small, beautiful pink clumps. After some research, I found out that they were the eggs of apple snails, which are found throughout the world. To protect their eggs against underwater prey, several types of apple snails deposit their eggs above the waterline of ponds, swamps, and rivers they inhabit. The oldest known apple snails are from Africa and Asia and 160 million years old. I felt that there was a connection with Judkins Park, a park in historically African-American neighborhood with the neighboring of Asian community. I attempted to mimic where the apple snails lay, scaled up to human size and placed with invasive love. The egg formations were scattered throughout the park as viewers were encouraged to explore. A challenge that occurred was vandalism. A lot of the installed objects were deliberately torn down and battered. Once informed, I laid more eggs in a more visible, compact area with better signage and height clearance, and those eggs survived through the end. In terms of sustainability, this project later made me realize my impact of choice and use of microplastics. A cute picture of some kids discovering the artwork. I was contacted by a Seattle University student, Olivia. She and her community mentors were interested in inviting local artists to do workshops with women of color mothers from an elementary school called Bailey Gertzhard. I taught a hand sewing workshop to a group of 8 women, half of which were non-English speakers and most of which had never sewn before. Myself and the organizers brought in our unused, outgrown, dog-nibbled items. We also found costume capes in the garbage and used it. At the end, it was warming to see the women excited to continue sewing with their new skills, tools, and material. I included these community moments in workshop because they ultimately really influenced my ability to gain opportunities and future commissions. Interning at the SAM led to my first museum commission, past internship at a gallery, and continual connection with the director allowed me a space to create the work that went into that museum. When applying for my first permanent commission, which I'll talk about more later, I was asked in the finalist interview how I engage with community. I was able to whip this out and say, hey, I did these things nearby. And honestly, I almost didn't do the workshop because there was no funding. And so often us artists are asked to do things without pay. However, in the end, it ended up being so beneficial. When awarded, Marcia let me know that my recent community work was a large factor in choosing me. By participating in these roles, you expand your network and gain community, which is always good. You never know when things will come back around. Erin is a fellow boot camper and a Japanese American artist. Her work is community-based and often references the World War II incarceration of her community. 76 years ago, Japanese Americans were subjected to family separation and detention. We swore we would never again let this happen to any other group. Yet today we watch as immigrant children and families are being separated and detained and civil liberties are being revoked. That's what she says. I find these 11 feet tall wheat paste murals quite powerful in context, imagery, and choice of material. This is a temporary work. Hugo was in boot camp the same year as me and was also granted a commission at Seattle Center. And so this is his temporary piece. He's extremely resourceful and these benches were weaved with a plastic material. Hugo went to print shops and collected their mistake signs to use for this project. More money in your pocket. After you learn more about public art, you start viewing public works with questions of what were they working with? What are some of the potential obstacles? Is there a wayfinding purpose? This project had a need to create aesthetics for utilitarian and safety purpose. How do you make it enjoyable? By painting and adding pointed tips to these poles, Sato and Corson were able to create a visual abstraction of scouring rush, a prehistoric plant indigenous to this region, commonly known as horsetail. This is a piece by Alice Gosti titled How to Become a Partisan. She writes that this is an immersive durational performance inspired by the Italian partisan movement during World War II liberated Italy from the Nazi fascists. Over time, the dress on the right, which was originally fully white, becomes red. I include this as an example of performance-based, community-engaged public work. The late Akio was a professor at the University of Washington during my schooling. With a deep relationship with clay, drawing upon his childhood in Japan, Akio's work was typically figurative, based on human body and expressive of human emotion and sensuality. On the right are large clay public figures in a busy city area. I appreciate his ability to keep true to himself while transforming his work for the exterior public. At the end of 2019, I was selected as the artist for an upcoming park in the Little Saigon, Seattle neighborhood. This is to be my first permanent piece. Going through an entirely new process of permanence, I understood that it would be a learning curve of similar but different steps, including navigating larger budget, long-lasting materials, collaborating with the landscape architecture team, outsourcing fabrication, hiring structural engineer, etc. This is just an image of what the park will look like. A large component of this project has been working with and listening to the community. Historically, this space has a lot of cultural context. Before it was known as Little Saigon, it had been Little Tokyo, and of course is ultimately native land. When the Japanese were incarcerated and were removed from the space, other neighboring communities moved in. This included Jewish, Black, Vietnamese, and Chinese families. With this, there is definitely the desire from both the Japanese and Vietnamese community to have representation, as well as an overall Pan-Asian theme. So during the early stages of research, it was important for myself and the project to meet with as many community stakeholders as possible. I enjoy simply listening to people and what feelings they hold. With these invaluable conversations of collected experiences and community stories in mind and heart, I then turned to Vietnam's history and my own experiences there. When I first arrived to Vietnam, I visited my aunt's home. She lives in a tube house, and to me it seemed 7 stories tall. These homes were built this way to extend space upwards, adding generational space, flow, and typically a storefront on the ground floor. I saw a connection between this architecture and the space in Seattle allotted for the park. The space holds the anticipation of buildings to come, reminiscent of the versatile ways Vietnamese people have adapted to their space in a growing city. While the purpose of lattices is to create security for storefronts, they also hold aesthetic charm. Each culture has varying traditional shapes and designs. In many traditional Pan-Asian homes, these open windows create a flow and connect us to the outside world. The community was really interested in having some sort of entrance, wayfinder, identifier for this park. I'm interested in showcasing a range of motifs, patterns recognizant of Pan-Asia, that together unify our shared notion of home in relation to Seattle, this land, our ancestry, and our connection to the natural world. This work is inspired by our shared conceptions of home and how they are constructed by our community and our surroundings, both the built and natural environment. From the busy city street exterior, folk will transition into a park oasis interior. I hope for the structure to appear light in opposition of the continual growing density of Seattle. It will be steel and painted. The green echoes the garden with particular connection to the long-lasting willow tree that lives on the other side of the park. While the tree is only expected to live 5 to 10 plus years, its significant memory to the community will be embedded in the sculpture through color. When considering the color, this is a huge thing for the community, something that they will have to live with for a long time, so we decided to ask for their feedback. I gave an option of solid green, solid yellow, and a third option of two-tone green, which is ultimately more costly, which can also affect whether it's even a possibility with fabricator. We gave them a voting period in which the feedback was quite spread, and I've decided to proceed with what I think is best. Another challenge was at the very beginning stages, upon first meeting with the community groups, I was expecting to hear potential aspects of their desires, such as play spaces for the children, Pan-Asian presence, integration and representation, etc. However, I was not necessarily prepared to hear exactly what they wanted. Someone told me that they specifically wanted to see a golden star fruit. Due to the nature of my process, which is collecting all information possible and seeing where the connective ties lie, sometimes I felt like a robot trying to figure out all the pieces. Okay, there's this need and this need. And at some point, I had a conversation with my project manager where I told him that I felt like a computer generator. He advised that I ultimately am the artist and I cannot please everyone. After absorbing community feedback, this was when I kindly needed to push everyone out of my brain space and turn internally to stay true to myself. Another challenge is just finding fabricators that are willing and able to work within your budget. Ask around. I got rejected a lot of times before I found a loom. Oh, another challenge is that I do not have drafting skills. As shown previously, I have pretty elementary ways of conveying my visuals, and due to the project needs, I hired someone skilled in CAD who helped me create the drawings to fully convey the idea, measurements, etc., to both fabricator and committees. The renderings were then placed by the design team into the rest of the park to fully convey this sculpture in its future space. While I am an artist, the park was put together by the design team, Marassi Architects. They were hired before I was interviewed and had most of the components mapped out. For example, how they plan to deal with the grade change throughout the park while being ADA accessible. They also go through the same process of proposing ideas to community, getting rejected due to budgetary and or safety reasons, etc. Marassi team chose the play features and plants. Once I was on board and started finalizing design, feedback from the committee wanted more of the artwork's presence throughout the park. As an installation artist, I was totally on board. However, we're always running into the issue of money. A low budget way of getting the Pan-Asian design throughout the park is by sandblasting on concrete, so the details will go on the park benches. Initial comparisons for temporary versus permanent work. I have it listed here, and I guess I'll just read it for you, but feel free to take a screenshot. So for temporary, material choices can be fairly open. It really depends on the timeline, but you are very much so able to use ephemeral materials. For permanent, there's the factor of longevity, and oftentimes there's a specific list from your commissioning agency of what is accepted or not. There's a big price differentiation and maintenance needs. With permanent, there's also, both will have installations, but permanence, I didn't realize that the install would be such a large part of the budget. Like I have to have footings for my permanent piece, and I did not realize that that would take half of my money. And so just take that into consideration. There's a lot that goes into it, the cranes, the helpers, and sometimes you like to install things, and there's other times that maybe you want someone else to do it for you. And I'm at that point where I want someone else to do it for me, so I don't have to be liable for it. For community interaction, for temporary, it's really what you want to do. Maybe it's related to your concept that you want to work with the community, or you don't. For permanent, it can depend on your contract. Some of them want you to work with them, and then others maybe don't have it specifically in there. However, I believe it should be encouraged to know the space that you are working with. Concept, sorry, part of it's hidden by the videos. One second, I don't know. Oh, concept. Some, for temporary, there will be some idea review with your project manager, but you have more creative control. Since your project is displayed for less amount of time, there's a more likeliness that you can talk about maybe more hard pressing subjects. Concept for permanent, it has to be there for a long time. And so it goes through a lot of different committees and approvals, like the historical preservation and the city and Parks and Rec. And so listening to stakeholders is very important. You throw out ideas and there's potential for rejection. Let's see, review. For temporary, as I mentioned earlier, I had like a ProView meeting and some stuff, but not too much. And then for permanent, there's a lot more check-ins, a lot more meetings, and I'm gonna show you kind of the timeline sheet for the project that I'm working on, just to give you an idea of what that can look like. If I can get out of here. Oh, sorry. Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, fabulous. So this is what our timeline looks like. And some of this I wasn't even involved in. So this whole beginning chunk, I was not a part of. This is all the work that was done before me. And then I was brought in about here. And so we started with some community meetings and then presenting to community meetings and just letting people know kind of who I was as the artist. And then we start going into design. And as you can see, there's just a lot of target points that you must hit along the way. So we get 30% mark and then 60% mark, and you go through the same steps again. They just want to make sure that you're making progress and that the feedback they gave is being implemented. And so, yeah, that's kind of what it looks like. And then I know it's not doing that great. Oh, basically, once you get approval, then you go to construction. And then that takes like a whole nother year. So basically, at this point, I have my concept done. I have a fabricator in line. We are just waiting for approval. And then once the construction bid is sent out, then we have to collaborate with construction to talk about footings and all that stuff. But that can't happen until they're chosen, if that makes sense. I'm gonna try and find my PowerPoint again. Here we go. All right. So yeah, timeline wise, temporary, it's very much so project based, and then permanent, it's very long. There's a lot of working parts, some of which are your responsibility, others outsourced. So staying on top of communication, especially on your timeline as things shift, especially with the pandemic, a lot of things have shifted and prices have also gone up. So making sure that you're staying on top of that, making sure that your material rates don't go up. And if they do, how are you going to shift your project to make it work? I am working on my second permanent piece for North Seattle College. And so I'm in the very beginning stages of it, still kind of figuring out the concept, but a similar timeline. At first, I met with the art committee and listened to what they were interested in. They provided me some research and studied that, and then did a tour at the facilities. And then there's the time for you to think as the artist. And at this point, I had a concept, and it was about concrete because it's a brutalist building. And as I was doing research, reaching out to artists and installers and people that work with the materials, I'm finding out that it's just way too expensive. And so I'm at the point where I don't really know what I'm gonna do. So we're gonna figure it out, but it'll be all good. And we're getting to the end of my presentation. Oh, I just took a photo of something. So my biggest advice is to expand your network. Challenges will come up and you don't have to know everything. And that's why there's a lot of people to help. A tip from artist Catherine Barbanel is identify who you need to help you, seek their advice, and be willing to adjust your project accordingly. So all these people in this Zoom room, we're all here for you. And if you ever need to, ask something, shoot an email. So another list of considerations and challenges, things just to consider when you're thinking about a project. Site specificity, community, feel free to take a screenshot. You don't have to address everything, but what are the main connections? Think about the potential risks, because it happens. Vandalism, public safety, liability, maintenance. Chris Brew is another artist, and one of his tips is to think and create beyond your experience and capabilities. Ask for support from your project manager, other artists, architects, fabricator, and engineers to help expand your range of possibilities. Pay yourself, work within your budget. And when you find people, and then you got to find people that are willing to work with your budget. It can be difficult to find art-friendly fabricators and engineers. Not everyone is as willing to be creative with aesthetics and build of large-scale artwork, but ask around. Be confident in your ability and understanding of how to convert from temporary to permanent. You are familiar with the general steps, now amplify it to a larger scale. Interviews will ask how you plan to manage your budget and or if you're able to handle larger scale projects when making the jump. And then lastly, consider labor and time commitments to proposals, concepts, and projects. Is applying to the specific opportunity worth your time, or are your efforts and genuine interest stronger and more fitted towards something else? Rejection is real, don't give up. You can do it. That's all I have.
Thank you, Kalina. We love working with you. It's been such an honor to watch your practice grow over the years.
So lucky to have met you both.
Yeah, that was great. That was a lot of information.
Okay.
But it's good. It's all good.
So I'm hoping, please ask your questions now. We'll take about 5 minutes to see if there's any questions for Kalina. That was packed with lots of information.
So put the questions in the chat.
Or you can
Just
unmute
let us
yourself.
know. Don't be shy.
I hope you couldn't hear my
So
dog. She was snoring the whole time and I was like kind of distracted.
I didn't hear it. Somebody asked if the first workshops have been recorded. They were. It starts a little bit in the first person, like 1 minute into their presentation. I'm just still figuring out how to upload it to YouTube, but that will be done this week. So both of these presentations will be uploaded along with next week's. Next question was, Kalina, what benefited you most from learning, starting out with studio skills into becoming a public artist?
What benefited me most from learning with studio skills? I would say understanding how the process of how things are created, just physically built, from concept to the physicality, or vice versa, from dealing with material to concept. Because I think that a lot of times as public artists, we are given a list of materials that work. And so for my brain, I'm like, okay, well, how can we expand on that material? Because I'm given this point blank thing, like how can I change it into something a little bit more than what it physically is, if that makes sense.
The next question is, can you speak more to how you got to making public art / being approved for public art opportunities, meaning getting, commissioned? It seems like the world of public art is very elusive with lots of boundaries, which is also true.
It really started off after I graduated, just doing, like, trying to see what opportunities there were in the city, and kind of finding these opportunities from the city of Seattle that were temporary public works, and then applying to that, going into the boot camp. Brain moment. So in doing that, and really, like, I went into that boot camp like with my A game. I was like, I'm gonna absorb everything. Like, I knew there was an opportunity at the end of it. I was like gung-ho. And so really just doing that, it takes, I'm sorry, I don't know if my brain's working in answering this question. Can you speak to being approved?
You can add that, so all across, because I know that we have half people from the US, half people from Canada, there's opportunities at your local arts agency. So always sign up and make sure you are on the email list for all of those agencies. And especially like, there's like Toronto, Edmonton, Michelle, who's going to speak next, is from Edmonton. Like, sign up for those lists, Calgary, all of them, right? Because they're going to have opportunities for local artists, but also artists from outside of their locality, right? And so see what opportunities are available that way. Public art is interesting because unlike some like grants where they can only grant to your local agency, public art, they can hire people from all over the country or the world. But also sometimes people fund their own public art, which isn't always, but like think about ways. I've seen people do really interesting interventions. My first public art piece, I thought I was going to talk about it today, but I'm not. Me and my collaborator just funded ourselves and did an outdoor intervention, and we were able to use that to start applying for more work. So that's one thing. Let's see, we have lots of questions. So I'm going to answer two more questions, and then, or we're going to answer two more questions, and then we're going to jump into Michelle, who's patiently waiting. One question is there a listed guide to fabricators? It depends on the city that you live in. Most places don't have a list of fabricators, unfortunately. But what we always recommend is reaching out to a local artist that you've seen their work and asking if they're willing to share. Some are not, but some are totally down to share their fabricators. So just you can just look up people's emails on their website and kind of say, did you have a really great fabricator experience? Are you willing to share? The next question is, are there things about the municipal system that seemed unnecessary when working on your first project? This is for Kalina. Are there any things about the municipal program you would want to change to make it easier for artists?
I guess, can you further define municipal?
I think the question is, what are ways that government agencies can make it easier for artists to get into public art?
Okay. Okay, so one thing that to tag on to what Alicia was saying about the list of fabricators and stuff like that, oftentimes your agency is not allowed to tell you who to work with. And so that's why they ask you to go through an artist or like, hey, I have this friend, you should email them and see who they're working with. And it's the same thing with insurance. They are not allowed to tell you who to use. So you pretty much have to go through your network and ask who they're working with. So keep a list of people, even if they reject you, you never know if you can work with them later on. Reject you as in like budget or things don't work like that, not because of you. Um, and then things that working with the government, you know, for me, I feel like I had a pretty good experience. However, I know that there have been difficulties for people that maybe aren't as technologically advanced. And it's something that Marcia, she was my project manager for Little On. Something that she did that I really admire is that she, because this project was so immersed in that they wanted an Asian artist that could talk about the community and address all these things, she went that further step to get all of the work, all the calls translated into multiple languages and made sure that there were translators at every workshop so that we could start to open up that community and try and bring in, you know, people that aren't, that, yeah, is, I don't, you know what I'm trying to say. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then our last question was elaborating on how to get more, how to get projects, which I can probably answer as well. And the second question goes into that too. You don't need a degree or to be an established artist per se to get a public art project, but they do look at your past work. So if there's ways that you've worked on like a large scale installation, that helps, but also we'll keep talking today about other ways to move into the practice. Because I know like if you're a painter, that's going to be like, you're going to think, how do I take my paintings and get into public art? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Thank you, Kalina. Again, we're always just, it's a gift whenever you get to talk to us. And like I said, I didn't even know you had a new commission at a college, so it's super exciting.
Thank you
Next.
so much.
Great, thanks, Kalina.
Thank you. Our next artist is from Edmonton. Michelle Campos Castillo is a Salvadorian visual artist living in Edmonton. She's been the recipient of several public art commissions from the city of Edmonton, including Plantanos, a set of 3 sculptures on permanent display at the Belvedere Transit Center. She's currently working on a graphic novel memoir based on her experience immigrating to Canada as a child. And we're excited to have her talk about her practice. Please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory in what is known as Canada. It's Edmonton, Alberta. So not too far from Seattle, probably closer than Ottawa. Yeah, so I'll get started with my presentation here. Let me just close this chat. Preview. Okay. So I was born in El Salvador, and this is my passport from when I immigrated to Canada in 1991. And I say this because it tends to inform everything about my practice and like the journey that it took to get to making public art and the obstacles I still continue to face, you know, as an immigrant trying to make art. I started with graphic design. I went into graphic design because it was just like a practical solution. I was always into art. And again, like that immigrant experience, I needed to make my own money as quick as possible. Just being from a single immigrant mom, it just made sense. It was quickly very discouraging as a career. It's a very white and male dominated field. I see those things changing, but you know, I graduated in 2004, so it's been a while. It's been a long time coming. And I have to thank people like Vivek and Black women and women of color in the world for giving me that opportunity as a graphic designer to expand my practice beyond what was available in Edmonton at the time, which is, I guess the equivalent in the States would be, being a province like Texas, where oil money was, the dominant income. So all the projects were very like, oil or government heavy, and people like Vivek invited me to do these creative projects at their institutions that really helped me, explore my creativity outside of those corporate limitations. Like when she was working at George Brown College, we did these like queer Valentine's cards, and it just like was able to grow my illustration skills and just expand the idea of what graphic design and the purpose that it could be. It wasn't just advertising and marketing, it can serve a whole, underrepresented community as well. I did this other project with Ryerson University, and I've done several projects that are very similar since then, just around consent. So again, this was with Farah Khan out of Toronto as a facilitator, where she works in the consent office at Ryerson University. And we created basically these self-care guides for survivors of sexual assault. And, a lot of my projects seem to be around self-care because a lot of people, were inspired by this movement and went on to create their own projects. So I've been really lucky that, I was able to step out of corporate design and do a lot of freelance. So that's how I've been, making ends meet. But this goes back to, coming to Canada as an immigrant, and my first exposure to art in general was, graffiti. This is an image of light rail transit here, which is what we have. And there's a lot of, that graffiti along, those transit lines. And it was like the first time I saw that, art represented in that way. And it was definitely inspiring. It continues to inspire what I want to do, because it to me, this feels like, totally accessible art. You don't have to pay. There's less barriers for people to see public art. And it's why I, was drawn to it in the first place, although I never expected to be here. Like my practice is very different. Like I don't have, an industrial design background or an architecture background, which is usually what a lot of the public artists have. So it's surprising to be here, but I'm trying to make it work within the very real limitations of these practices. So through doing graphic design and starting to make art in general in the city, I got to know more and more of the arts community. And at this time this was 2011, but I think maybe a couple of years before, the public art program started in my city, which is the 1% for public art program, which basically says that any like city established like new construction has to give 1% to build a public art alongside that. So it would be like a transit station or like a recreation facility. They would have to put a certain amount of money aside to make public art. So this was something that I didn't apply for. I was just contacted by friends who had seen my work as a graphic designer, and this was a temporary project where they wanted to paint this alleyway downtown. So we're painting right on the road. Again, never done anything like it. It's definitely like very intimidating to think about it. And this was like 10 years ago. My practice is very different from where it is now, but it was a huge, huge space to cover. So this was part of like my concepts. I was again, being an immigrant, I'm always thinking about the land that I'm on, which is Indigenous land, and like how I can speak to this land and get to know this land. Because immigrating, you know, you're kind of just forced to assimilate into like what we know as Canadian culture, which is very Western culture, which is very white culture, right? And for me, that was always such a disconnect for being in this country. And it felt super random at the time how my family ended up in Edmonton of all places. Like I had never heard of it, you know, all that. So I think back here, I was trying to, you know, find ways to connect with the city, with the land around me. So I was looking at plants, and like a challenge of covering such a big space that this project needed was we had to make stencils that would make the process easier, and we were going to use sprayers. So I had to make a stencil that repeated this pattern. And it was all done in an afternoon. So it was like trying to come up with a pattern. And, you know, like in the end, I'm not like a super flowery person. So I kind of stepped away from that. You know, this was a time where Edmonton, and still continues to have a bit of an identity crisis. You know, it's not a place that a lot of people know. It's not a place that people think is cool. It's a lot of place that people move away from. So at the time I was seeing all this sort of art that was, you know, rebranding cities around the world with the airport codes, you know. So I was like, okay, let's talk about Edmonton. Let's call it YEG. So that's where I jumped off from to try to find some pride in the city. So on the left here is just like some rough concepts. And initially I had wanted to make these like sort of conversation bubbles as something that could be editable, but then people, that was again a barrier in the sense that, like, you know, this was a city project, so they were like, you know, we don't want to encourage graffiti or whatever. So that got, you know, nixed. But yeah, so but I kept with the theme, and what you see on the right is what the stencil ended up looking like on the street. So it's just kind of like sort of trying to rebrand the city, trying to make it cool, trying to show what I love about it. And this project was kind of like the start of that. So this is what it ended up looking like. I worked with two other artists who'd had their own patterns and their own team. And on the right, you'll see that this is us spraying the giant stencils with spray guns. So that was like first public art experience. It was temporary. And again, it was still using those graphic design skills, you know, it was still very much like a two-dimensional, you know, flat surface. Next up, there was another project that again, it was an open call, which is like you submitted your concepts, which those calls aren't great because you're basically giving them a free idea, right? So these were smaller projects. I think it was like maybe a couple $1,000s per design if you were picked. It was around, so these are like garbage trucks that they were gonna wrap with vinyl, and these garbage trucks, you can still see them around the city. So this was a concept of mine. And again, on the left, I'm just like, again, playing with the same motifs and, you know, just like making funny like inside jokes with friends and stuff. And then on the right is like a concept that again, you know, that knowledge of Edmonton and what was here on this land before I arrived was, you know, always in the back of my mind. So I thought about bison and like how that's, you know, indigenous to this land as a you know, as for hunting and feeding of, you know, indigenous people's practices. So yeah, I ended up just staying in my lane in that sense of just, you know, doing my own fun pattern. And so this is how the trucks look. I haven't been able to see this one truck out in the world. So these are pictures that have been provided for me. This was the second concept. Again, I just did like these two little dogs running around the city, and it's on the truck. This one I have seen. out in the world. And they really thought it wouldn't last because Edmonton is very snowy and we use salt on our roads. So like cars and get eroded. So they thought like the vinyl wouldn't last, but it's still going like so many years later, which is pretty neat. So there's like a big gap in my practice. It's probably like 5 or 6 years, you know, and I think with anything in life, art and healing, you know, there's this expectation that things will just kind of go in a straight line and, you know, build over time. But, you know, there's been some back and forth, and, you know, it took a while for me to get back to this practice. And yeah, so as I was mentioning before, Edmonton has this public art program. So we see these public art calls come up in the, you know, the newsletters for the Edmonton Arts Council, which is a funding body for Edmonton. In Canada, we have funding in first like municipal, like your city, and then the province, which is like the state, and then there's another art funder that is like Canada-wide. So these are the city calls. And you know, for a while they are coming pretty often as like new developments were happening and like one of those oil boom phases. And they're pretty intimidating. Like they're about 16 to 20 pages at least, telling you the requirements of what they need. And then they usually have, you know, a bit of like the architecture sketches or like the landscape. And you know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it. And so I saw these calls come up often, and I knew friends that worked at the Arts Council who mentioned that, you know, it was always the same people applying, you know, a lot of people with industrial design backgrounds and or architecture backgrounds. And I mean, this is another thing where like the taxpayer is very present in these conversations as well. So there's like a big push to get local people, because we have some public art pieces that are like $1 million pieces that are, you know, made by people from like LA or, you know, Germany and stuff. So the taxpayer tends to get mad about money going elsewhere. So, you know, they're really trying to encourage, you know, local artists to apply, but, you know, it's pretty intimidating. I've never done anything like three-dimensional, like my classes in design school. I mean, I didn't take three-dimensional classes. It was always pretty intimidating. The classes I had to take, it made me cry, honestly, because it was just like my brain doesn't really function that way, or the way we were taught. So, but this public art call came for this neighborhood that I lived in Edmonton for most of my life. And it was like a smaller call, because these calls can be, you know, $1 million, $2 million, and you know, that's even more intimidating to know how to even handle that budget, or even know how you could go about constructing something. And so when there was a call that was very local and the budget was a bit more reasonable, I was like, okay, I want to apply for this. Like, I don't want someone else to get this, because it is about, you know, the neighborhood that raised me. So it was a little spiteful for me to apply, to be honest. But, you know, I did it. This was me trying to figure out through Facebook, you know, about fabricators, because I had this idea in mind and I had no sense of how to execute it. So I asked for art-friendly manufacturer. I didn't know at the time that there is specifically arts manufacturing companies around that will take your ideas and make them happen. So I was cold calling like just random fabricators that I found on Google, and just asking if this idea I had would be possible. And I was just feeling pretty like discouraged by the process. And I think it's all about gatekeeping. I think there's definitely people that didn't want to share their information with me, which was really disheartening because like it, it just keeps like these forms of art like really stagnant and white, honestly. So I asked artists that I knew that were like more successful, and some of their responses were really terrible. Some of them were like, yeah, those are really hard to get. I don't know if you should be doing that kind of thing. So, but through that Facebook call, someone that has a bit of a background in industrial design was like, yep, these are the manufacturers in Calgary, which is like a few hours away. Like, this is what they do. So just give them a call and discuss. And this was just in the proposal phase of things, right? So, and the system with the public art program here has gone through several revisions now, but at the time they were asking for a concept. So again, I think providing a concept benefited me because they were able to see that it was a good idea. But at the same time, if I hadn't been chosen, I would have just given them a free idea. They've revised this now, and you have to apply with essentially a resume. So, plátanos, plantains. So when I was thinking of this call and what kind of concept I wanted to submit, they had two places where they wanted to put the public art, either outside in this courtyard. It's a bus station. It's a bus shelter, actually. So because it's very cold up here, we have like whole buildings where you wait for the bus and semi-indoors so that you're warm. So I was trying to think of, the community around there. And it was, again, a lot of us immigrants, a lot of Central Americans, but there's also been a big influx of like Cubans and Colombians, and also like a lot of people from, African countries, a lot of people from Somalia. And I was trying to think of things that united us, and like food it just made sense to me. It's especially plantains. It's something that's like eaten all over the world, and it's so versatile that it fit all of these different cuisines, and it just made sense to me. And I just kept thinking about like growing up in El Salvador and seeing how the plantain grows on trees. And again, the site specific for this bus shelter was like either sculpture outside or some sort of hanging sculptures inside. So I started to think of the plantain trees and how they would hang naturally, and how I could transfer that to a 3D form. And these are the sketches I provided to the manufacturer, and I talked to them before submitting my proposal. And luckily, the name of the company is Carvel. I will never hide that information from anyone. And they were just starting out at the time. So they were just very open to just quoting me for the project and fitting within the budget. So talking to the public art officer later, who's like the project manager, essentially, they said that it was very helpful that I had a quote from the manufacturer that, helped me get this idea forward. So I was awarded the project, which was like very shocking to me. But it's super exciting. We started by making, printing actually these 3D printed plantains that they copied from 5 actual real plantains that I brought down to Calgary. So they 3D printed them, and then they made resin molds. And then they also made this funny contraption to stick around like 70 plantains into these 3 separate bundles. So on the left is what they look like in the station, in the bus shelter. And that's me standing next to the finished piece. they're like about 130 pounds each. And again, with Carvel, like I did very little in terms of, doing constructing anything. Going with a manufacturer like that is helpful in the sense that they have, engineers on site, they have construction on site, they'll have their own insurance and stuff. The issue is that you end up paying for all of that, right? But I mean, I learned so much in that process because they are very generous people. So, I was able to come down and see the work at every stage and learn about, why they had chosen this and each step. So that was like extremely helpful. I mean, look, if I could build these myself now, like, it'd be a different story. Like, I have more skills through, that sort of mentorship that I was given by Carvel to feel more empowered to do these cheaper eventually, or something like that. But yeah, this was my first permanent piece with Arts Council here in Edmonton. Next up is, again, we have a lot of construction going around like the light rail transit. So this is going into the west end of the city. This is what the site looks like now. It's just a residential street. And we're basically, or I should say that this was a public art call. So I submitted to this to make this ramp art. And they're basically, it's concrete art. These are the examples. And this is kind of what it will look like after it's done construction, but just like essentially a car ramp, but we're putting, art into the concrete on the sides. And these are just some examples I pulled from the internet. The right one is something that's in Calgary, and we're cities that are like connected by a river. So it's like fish tend to be a theme that comes up. And then when this public art call came up, I was really interested because I had just come back from a trip to El Salvador and I had seen this ramp project there. And it was, when I did more research into it, it was done with, I think, anthropologists and the artists worked together. And this is called like the Jaguar Passage. So they used a lot of like, well, the jaguar imagery to like, species that's, found, well, used to be found in that area, tropical area. And then just also like markings and drawings from the indigenous communities. And I thought that was like really cool. And it just fits into what I want to do, which is like, bring culture and bring more of that conversation with the city and the land into my work. So this is Edmonton's River Valley. As I was saying, we have this river connecting us. And I tend to spend a lot of time there. El Salvador is an ocean country. So this theme of water comes up in my work too. And we're by this body of water that has a rich history of, this rich indigenous history, of people traveling across it and through it. So it's a place I like to visit often. And it just made me think of like also the journeys that we as immigrants have to take to get to Canada. So I tried to like bridge those ideas together. And I thought about like where that river meets ocean, which is an actual place, estuary, I think it's called. So then the next step after getting this project was to do some renderings. So that, yeah, I just played around with like river streams and then some like textures from the ocean bubbling and some waves. And this is what I submitted to, the city. And these the concrete, the way it's going to be placed on the walls of the ramps is they're going to create molds out of rubber, and these are being made in somewhere in the States, I forget. So we essentially had to make this 5-foot repeated pattern. And we could do like a repeated design, but we could only do 2 molds because they're very expensive to make. So essentially my rendering here is just telling the 3D designer, the depth of how I want this to come out on the wall. Yeah, this was passed to a 3D designer, but it turned out like just a vector rendering was fine. And that's the thing, you, like was mentioned earlier before, you do tend to have to hire other artists or other like professionals in this line of work. Like some people like, Carvel have all those people in staff, but if you want to save money, you kind of have to make these connections and meet people that can help you out along the way. So this is the size of, this is just like a rough rendering of the ramp. So then my pattern is just going to get repeated on these 2 ramps, and I'm just using one pattern on one side and the other on the other side. So we're just kind of flipping them. And this is the 3D rendering that I think it's Jordan did for me, just to submit to the council. So you see how like, there's a height limit of how much can come out of that wall. So I think it's like 60 millimeters. So in my rendering here, you'll see that the 60 millimeter is like the tallest. And that shows here how this is that white part in the rendering, and it sits at the highest level. And this is a project that's going to take like 5 years to make, because it's not like they haven't started construction yet. So we're just submitting these our parts for the molds for that to be ready once like those concrete walls go up, but it's going to be a while. And this is the second 3D rendering of my design. Yeah, 5 feet tall around, and again, this pattern is going to repeat. So I was going to say earlier that after like the plantains that I did at that first station, they were really well received. I think I was like really confident that I could keep going on the path, but there was like lots of rejection, and I bombed a lot of interviews because after that project, like I mentioned before, the submission process changed, where you basically submitted your resume, an example of your work, and then you would be interviewed, and then there was a selection committee. So you weren't submitting any ideas, which was really different from what was my first experience. So I was happy to get the ramps that I had just shown, but I was, it seemed like the bigger projects were still really out of reach. And I mean, in a way, they still feel really out of reach. I was actually contacted by, again, some local artists, and we put a team together to do a proposal for this other light rail transit station. This is on the left here. It's a big football stadium, and as you see, we have a lot of parking lots, but they're renovating one of these sections to include public art and just modernizing the building. It's not a very accessible building where the train stops. So we submitted to this piece, and my friend here, Tiffany Shaw, she's an architect, a Métis architect in the province, and she has a lot of experience, a lot more experience with public artwork. She's definitely someone very inspiring. I'll share all of these people's names in the chat after, because they're all have amazing practices on their own. So we kind of created this, like, I don't know, we jokingly called it the dream team, because we all have, you know, different backgrounds, but like we wanted to see if we could come up with something together. So there's Sean C. He does a lot of work in the Chinatown community. Becca Taylor, she's artist curator. Tiffany, who's an architect, I said, and then Christina Battle, who does who's also an amazing artist in town here. And then this is another thing that happens through word of mouth. We met Will Johnston through Tiffany, who does great manufacturing, and it's just him. It's a one-man show, so it's like, it's great because it's a lot more accessible in terms you can have in terms of having conversations, and he can teach you a lot about like materials and things, and it's definitely a lot cheaper. But on the downside, you have to, you know, get the insurance and everything else on your own, which, yeah, it's definitely challenging, but you also end up saving a lot more money in the process. So this was the team that started it, and I'll just give you a little preview of how we worked as a team, which I think the question before is like, how, you know, to even get started when like all these calls require, you know, a CV with experience, and that feels really inaccessible if you haven't done public art before. I think, you know, building community and teaming up with people that have a bit more experience, or combining skill sets is a really good way to do it as well, to get your foot in the door, because you end up learning a lot. So we were working with a program called Miro, and basically we just threw examples of public art that we liked into this like giant board, and, you know, we would meet weekly and talk about kind of, and brainstorm, you know, words that made sense to us, words that were inspiring, and like directions we wanted to take this in. So you know, we're all like racialized people, so, you know, we thought a lot about gathering. So we really wanted to make this piece to be a place to gather, especially because this is a transit station. Most of the people that come through are just passing through, essentially. You know, they're coming, they use it as a way to get to work because it's close to downtown, or they use it just during football games and events. So we wanted to create a place for local people, or just anyone, to be able to sit down and gather, you know, together. It's just like a more welcoming space than just a transient space. So we looked a lot of different kinds of like furnitures and play structures, and we really were all drawn to these pieces, these like more airy sort of pieces, you know, that didn't feel so stark, you know, something that felt more inviting. And color has always been a thing that we wanted to emphasize. Like, we just wanted something big or something colorful and inviting. So this is kind of where our inspiration started coming from. So it kind of, it seemed to naturally flow into the fact that we're kind of make sort of like outdoor furniture pieces. So then the next step was like designing that. And we used just like play materials to design these clusters of like, you know, these sort of funky furniture pieces that are going to be sitting in that area. And so right now we're just in that process of figuring out materials to make this this happen for us. We did do some tests with just like metal framing like this, and it wasn't very comfortable. So we're trying to figure out a way to like find maybe just something that goes on top that feels more comfortable, that's within our budget. And that's where having like a really knowledgeable manufacturer is really helpful, because he can speak to prices and he can speak to like the limitations of like making concrete super colorful, which again, I would have no idea about. But yeah, that's the end of my my presentation.
Wow, that was just fabulous, Michelle. I'm like, I was standing over your projects before and now I'm even more so. Lots of people just saying how awesome your work is in the chat. There was a question about what does insurance cover, and I can answer that, which is it covers any liability you have while working on a project, like somebody getting hurt, things like that. But once the project is installed, it doesn't necessarily cover you. That could be for a later day because it could get more complex, but that's the gist of that. I really appreciate, like, we had that question right after Kalina and Michelle that was like, how do you take a 2D practice to a permanent, right? And then you really showed us as a graphic designer how you've been able to do these permanent projects. And you really started with like a 2D application on 3D materials, right? Like on the garbage truck, right? And the street, which isn't really three-dimensional, but really then scaling up, right, to when you got to the Plantanos piece and then hiring a fabricator, which is really what people do. So I really do think of staying within your comfort zone at first, right, as you saw from her practice, and you can still work within what you do to start working in a permanent context. Any questions?
There's one that was sent directly to me. I don't know if you
Oh,
can
okay.
see it.
Yeah,
says,
I can ask that one then, please.
it says, what is the interview process like?
Mm.
It's pretty intimidating, honestly. And I really did bomb several interviews before getting another public art project, because it was, again, especially working with a city, you have the city planners, you know, you have stakeholders, and then you have people from the community who are all in this interview. And you know, I thought like the work could sort of speak for itself. So, but that wasn't the case. You know, I was like, I did it. Like, you can trust me. I can do another project, kind of thing. But I asked for help, and I think that's what the public art officers are there for. You know, to strengthen your communication skills too. You know, like one of the things that they told me is that like they wanted to see the process, and I hadn't shown the process. You know, because like it's such an important part of getting the job for people to know that you're considering, you know, the community, you're considering all the other factors too, right? So yeah, it can be super intimidating, but yeah, you just kind of keep trying.
Yeah, I think yeah. Hopefully we can, as administrators, make it less awful, but it's not always fun.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Michelle? You were really thorough. Let's see. I'm gonna give it another beat. Well, I'm gonna say thank you again. Michelle, if you could put those names in the chat if you don't mind. And thank you so much. It was fabulous. So if you wanna do your hand clap signal or unmute yourself, but thank you, Michelle. This, we just have a few more minutes and we're gonna go fairly quickly. Me and Marcia are just gonna talk a little bit about some other ways, other artists who have gone from temporary to permanent. Let me see how to come, 1 second. And then we will end our session today and we'll see you again next week. So 1 second. You should be seeing my screen. So you've already had 2 artists talk about their path from going from a studio artist to a public artist, and also probably maintaining a practice for both. And so what makes public art different than studio art? And I'm gonna say 3 things: materials and durability. So, and I saw like Kalina really talked a lot about temporary works. Michelle's works were more permanent, but really like when you're working either in temporary or studio, like you can, one, when you're in your studio practice or a gallery environment, you can control the environment. You can control the sound, the temperature, the lighting, right? You can really create an environment for the viewer to experience your work. And when you're in the public, that is not the case, right? There's noise, there's sound, there's dust, there's, like bird poop, which actually, surprisingly enough, starts eroding paint sometimes, weird stuff like that, right? So those are some of the differences, right? Like you might be used to working in a way that is where you're able to control the entire environment or use materials that are ephemeral that wouldn't last for 30 years. So thinking you can still, as these two artists just showed us so brilliantly, you don't have to change who you are as an artist. You just have to think about how you approach the site and the work differently. So thinking about things like stainless steel, bronze, glass, there's a lot of other permanent materials as well, but those are obviously the most frequent. Ceramic tile is one. And then making sure that they're durable. Community engagement is the second thing I would say, right? And I think Kalina talked really brilliantly about navigating your own process with what the public wants, right? But community engagement is really important because you're working in a community that usually isn't your own, right? Like Michelle said, she was able to work in a community that she grew up in. We don't always get to do that. So we need to like really listen to that community. I had a project in Tacoma and somebody told me they didn't want any bright colors. And as much as I kind of at first didn't like that, I had to sit with, I don't live here. And this person has lived in this community for 3 generations. And so I created a muted color palette. So I think we really have to think about who's gonna, as my friend Kristen says, who's part of Third Way Creative, who lives here, who plays here, and who works here, right? Those are your audience, and those are the people you need to be getting feedback from. Whereas in our studio practice, it's a personal inquiry. It's whatever we're interested in as artists. And then the final thing is audience, which I kind of touched on again, but in a studio practice or a gallery practice, I think we're so used to, again, people coming into a white cube space. We were able to create the environment, all these different things, right, from the lighting and like I always said, and then you usually have an audience that's ready to be engaged in contemporary art, right? They're ready to have their boundaries pushed sometimes, whereas public art, sometimes you have to be way less risky because you have lots of people who might not want to engage with your art, but it's on their path to work or home or school or wherever, right? So you have to think more broadly about the impact of your work, the ideas that you're talking about, and the people who will be experiencing them. Marcia, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's great. We have a lot of pictures we're going to show quickly,
Yeah,
right?
she's like, I know, and she's like, we're over time. You're free to leave and see the video later too. I totally understand. So artists with public and studio practices, this is Marcia. I'll let you talk.
Okay, I just wanted to show just a few artists' work that are in the Seattle area. This is some temporary work done by an artist named Marita Dingus, who has, I would say, is one of the more established artists in the field and was one of the first artists easily 30 plus years ago that created public artwork utilizing recycled materials. And she was known as sort of the recycled artist for a long time. And then of course, many artists started doing that as well. So these are some of her first studio works that had to do with materials that were just at hand. And doll making was one of the things that she liked to do a lot. So let's go to the next slide. So then she's moved on then to gallery work and museum work. This is a large piece that's in the museum in Bainbridge Island, just off the shores of Seattle. And then a gallery work that is done at Wanawari, which is the community site that Elishaba is one of the co-founders for. So again, here's her dolls.
Okay.
That's okay.
Oh,
So
okay.
you can see her work at large. Another artist I wanted to showcase, a native artist, Ryan Pedersen, who is in this area. She created a temporary artwork for us at the city of Seattle a few years ago. And this was an interactive temporary artwork that shows a map of the United States. And she did this really interesting piece that references native Indian schools that were called, they were border schools that happened 100 years ago. It was really horrible. The white people in this area of the United States, many of these schools were located around the United States, where they rounded up the Native children and put them in schools that had religious or military types of focus, and tried to take away the Native customs and language and religions that they had. And so this map of the United States was interactive. And so what you would do on the second slide, you'll see the white area where there's a handprint, activated a line, activated the name of the school, and then there would be a red line that goes to the area of the United States where this school took place. And this was horribly detrimental to the Native communities losing their identities. Next slide is some of her permanent work that she's done more recently. Elishba, you knew a little bit more about this piece. It's called Nexus.
I don't. It's on a historic prairie line trail, but it's
That's okay.
Like
it's
a
an
blanket and a permanent material and some other things.
It's an imaginative play area is what I do know about it. And it is an area for learning sort of intertribal relations. So it's about bartering and trading. And she just set up this permanent site to be able to activate an interest into this historical practice. Next image. Yuki Nakamura, she was another person who took some of our presentations for our public art bootcamp that Elishba and I did for many years. I just want to show some of her early works. On the left is a piece she did for a fashion show, and it was a piece called Red Stair. It was created with velvet, foam, wood, and a roller. So as she walked down the runway, the piece floated behind her as she walked. And then the other piece that she has is called Trespass Tree, which replicate, and it's just using wallpaper. And she did this temporary work that replicates the pattern on the trunk of a tree. Then I wanted to show finally her permanent works. The piece on the left are seating elements that she's created. I can't remember where that is, but the one on the right are light bulbs from historic places as well as modern light bulbs. And I wish I had a detail of it, but if you looked up any of these artists' work, you can find out more information about their temporary and permanent works. But this piece on the right, I really love. It was at Seattle City Light in their offices in the lobby elevator space. And there was a video piece that had a projector across from this area that would light up different light bulbs at different times. And they're really fantastic light bulbs, the old fashioned kind that Thomas Edison did, clear to the more modern LED lights that we have today. So these are just quick examples of temporary to permanent works by artists.
And I'll just go very quickly, like a beat. Simone Lee is a famous New York artist. This is her studio practice. You can see that she already was a sculptor, and then she was invited to create a large scale artwork for the High Line about a couple of years ago called Brick House. So this is the final artwork. It was permanently sited somewhere on the East Coast. Kara Walker, I think most people know who she is, right? From famous two-dimensional artist working around themes of race. And then we talked about this last week. Here is A Subtlety or Sugar Baby, her piece that was temporary artwork with creative time in the Domino Sugar Factory. Celeste Kooning is an artist that I know who works mostly in cut paper, as you can see here. And then her first permanent piece was $40,000 actually. And it's hard to believe that you can get cut steel and make something for $40,000 these days. But this is cut steel, and she worked with a fabricator. Sutton Bears Color is another artist team. They've shown in Canada and stuff. They do have a sculptural part to their practice. You can see these are, that was a gallery work. This was a temporary project where people were invited to do artworks on abandoned homes, and they covered it in string. And then their permanent work, this is called Salon, and it's it's supposed to look like a little gallery, and it's on the sidewalks. And I could not find the material that this is, but you can see that people were invited, the community's invited with chalk to make their own art in these frames. So they have a playfulness to their practice that they transform into their permanent work. And this is their newest permanent work, which is at the Google headquarters. And it's a big kind of Loch Ness monster. Pedro Reyes, famous artist, sculptor. Here's his studio practice. As you can see, lots of really intricate objects. And then he worked with Creative Time right before the 2016 election, where Trump was elected, to do a project called Democracy, where he made a haunted house that was all around our current political situation. So in Latino cultures, I think also in African cultures too, there's this practice of making these really elaborate caskets. And he took that and started playing on kind of Americans like overeating, obesity, like love for more and more larger than life. You can see this wooden sculpture. So basically you came into this haunted house and somebody would take you through to different rooms and you would have different experiences. So you saw his permanent practice has one type of material, and then he also can explore through a public practice of interacting with the population to talk about ideas of politics and things that are happening of the now. So that's what we have for today. Like we said, we have next week is our last session where we talk about really creating your public art concepts, where we have Marissa Gallimet from Ottawa and then Christopher Paul Jordan, who's out of Yale right now. Any questions before we end? And like I said, this video will be made available to you, and we'll send some links out as well to people who are registered. Let's see. Oh, great. I know we went really fast. Great. Thank you, everyone.
There's a lot to digest, but we hope you learned some new tips and enjoyed the presentations. We've spent a lot of time putting these all together, and there's tons to learn. And our goal is to encourage more people to apply for public art projects, and don't limit yourself to just your region, because people like to know and have artists from all over the country and a different country as well. So Canada and Americans are welcome to apply to different projects. Make sure you read the eligibility to make sure that that's possible for you. So with that, we're excited. We hope you join us next Monday at the same time, 3 to 4:30 East Coast time, and I'm sorry, West Coast time, and 6 to 7:30 on the East Coast.
Thank
Okay.
you.